It is another promising hot day in the broad desert. In the distance, a group of warriors rode under the rising sun, fearless, disciplined, and determined. Their skin darkened against the racing light as though defiant. Their hair curled tightly beneath their helmets. Their language was early Arabic, sharp and rhythmic. They were not strangers to this land. They were the land. These men led caravans across the Arabian deserts when most of the ancient world feared the sands. They controlled the trade routes that carried incense, gold, and spices between Africa and Asia. They fought wars, defended their tribes, built kingdoms, guarded sacred shrines, and commanded respect across the Arabian Peninsula. These were the early original Arabs, and something about them is rarely discussed today. Many of the earliest descriptions of Arabs, written by ancient historians, travelers, and even early Islamic scholars, describe them as dark-skinned people, closely related to the populations of the Horn of Africa and the Upper Nile. In simple words, the earliest Arabs were black. But this history has been blurred over centuries by migration, empire, politics, and changing identities. And that is exactly what we are about to uncover. Before we go further, if history like this sparks your curiosity, you should join our WhatsApp channel, because some conversations simply don't survive well on YouTube. On the channel, we share deeper historical threads, controversial documents and forgotten sources, polls and debates that challenge popular narratives, and stories that platforms often bury. It's a place for people who want the full history, not the edited version. If that sounds like you, then the link is in the pinned comment. Join us there. Now, let's go back to the desert. So why do some historians say the original Arabs were black? To understand this, we have to go back thousands of years, long before modern national borders existed, long before the kingdoms we recognize today. Arabia was part of a cultural and human corridor between Africa and Asia, and the people who first lived there looked very different from how many imagine them today. The earliest historical descriptions. Ancient writers left clues. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, described many Arabian and nearby populations as dark-skinned and closely connected to Ethiopians. In his book The Histories, one of the earliest surviving works of history from the ancient world, he used the Greek term aithayaps, meaning burnt-faced, to describe dark-skinned peoples living south of Egypt and across the wider southern regions known to the Greek world. He also placed the regions along the southern Red Sea, including parts of Arabia, inside the same connected world as northeastern Africa. In other words, from the very beginning of recorded history, Arabia's southern populations were already being described as part of that same darker southern zone. You see, in the ancient world, the word translated today as Ethiopian did not refer to the modern country alone. Greek writers use Aethiops as a broad geographic label for darker peoples living across the southern frontier of their known world, stretching from the Upper Nile through the Horn of Africa and across the southern Red Sea, including the Arabian side as well. So when ancient readers encountered this word, they would not have imagined Africa alone. They would have understood a much larger southern world of dark-skinned peoples that reached across both Africa and Arabia. Centuries later, historians were still making the same observations. The Roman historian Strabo also wrote about the physical similarities between people in southern Arabia and those in Africa. In his work, Geographica, a large survey of the known world, written during the early Roman period, he described the populations living along the southern Red Sea on both the Arabian and African sides as closely related in appearance and lifestyle. He presented evidence that this sea was not a boundary at all, but a corridor linking communities that had shared movement, exchange, and ancestry across its waters for centuries. Later summaries of earlier historical knowledge continue to point in the same direction. Scholars compiling traditions about Arab origins repeatedly associated the earliest Arab populations with the far south of the peninsula, especially regions closest to the African coast. Even 19th century scholarship preserved traces of this same understanding. The 9th edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica identified southern Arabia, especially Yemen, as the cradle of the earliest Arabs and emphasized its long-standing connection with the African side of the Red Sea. Some observers also noted that the earliest inhabitants of southern Arabia appeared darker than later populations. The explorer Bertram Thomas, after studying southern Arabian communities and earlier remains, concluded that parts of Arabia had originally been inhabited by darker populations, before later migrations reshaped the appearance of the peninsula. This was not surprising. The Red Sea separating Arabia and Africa is incredibly narrow in some places, only a short distance by boat. For thousands of years, people moved back and forth across it. And once we understand what early writers were already seeing, the next question becomes unavoidable. How far back does this connection between Arabia and Africa actually go? Arabia's deep African connection. Modern archaeology shows that the Arabian Peninsula was never isolated. Early human migrations moved from Africa into Arabia tens of thousands of years ago. Some of the earliest modern human remains outside Africa were found in the Arabian region. Genetically, many ancient populations of southern Arabia show strong ties to populations from the Horn of Africa. Modern genetic studies support this long-term connection. For example, the mitochondrial DNA study, Ethiopian mitochondrial DNA heritage, tracking gene flow across the Red Sea, identifies shared maternal lineages linking populations in Ethiopia with those in Yemen. This showed that movement between the two regions did not happen just once in the distant past. It happened repeatedly across long stretches of history. Another study published in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology, titled Mitochondrial DNA, reveals distinct evolutionary histories for Jewish populations in Yemen and Ethiopia, reached the same conclusion. It showed that populations moved back and forth between southern Arabia and the Horn of Africa, not once, but repeatedly, across deep stretches of history. And this connection was not just visible in genetic evidence. Places like Yemen and Oman historically had populations that early writers described as dark-skinned and African-looking. Travelers who visited the region noticed it too. The 18th century explorer Karsten Niebuhr, who documented communities in Yemen during his Arabian expedition, described strong physical and cultural links connecting populations living on both sides of the Red Sea. And even today, certain communities in these regions still preserve these older features. What makes this connection even more striking is that early Arab scholars themselves also left descriptions recognizing this darker diversity within Arabia. Some early Islamic historians also acknowledge the darker complexion of many early Arabs. The famous scholar Al-Jahiz wrote openly about the physical appearance of different Arab and African peoples, and he pointed out similarities between them. He described darker skin as a natural feature shared across regions connected by climate and geography, not something foreign to Arab identity. Centuries later, Ibn Khaldun offered a similar explanation. He wrote that climate shaped complexion across large parts of the world, including Arabia and Africa, and he treated darker skin in southern regions as part of a normal human pattern rather than an exception. These were not isolated opinions. They reflected what many scholars clearly recognized. Darker complexions had long been part of the natural appearance of many Arab populations. Other early Arabic sources reinforced this picture of how Arabs understood their own appearance. The 9th century scholar Al-Mubarad preserved a striking description from Fadl ibn al-Abbas, a cousin of the Prophet Muhammad, who once referred to himself as the Green One. At the time, this expression did not mean the color we think of today. It was a poetic way of describing a deep, dark complexion, like the rich color of a fertile oasis or a healthy date palm. Al-Mubarad explained that many Arabs of that period took pride in darker skin and sometimes contrasted themselves with lighter-skinned Persians and Romans. Early Arabic poetry preserved the same memory. The pre-Islamic hero Antar ibn Shaddad, whose mother was Ethiopian, was celebrated across generations as a symbol of courage and honor, and remembered in later tradition as the Black Knight. His story was not treated as unusual. It became part of the shared heroic tradition of Arabia. These accounts were not written centuries later to make a point. They reflected how early Arabs understood themselves at the time. And even more importantly, These descriptions were rooted in traditions that stretched back into the much older southern Arab civilizations that shaped the peninsula long before Islam. The southern Arab kingdoms. Long before Islam, powerful kingdoms already existed in southern Arabia. One of the most famous was the Kingdom of Saba, the civilization often associated with the legendary Queen of Sheba. These southern kingdoms controlled major trade routes linking Arabia, Africa, and the Mediterranean world, which helped maintain constant contact between populations on both sides of the Red Sea. Archaeological evidence also shows deep trade and cultural connections between Saba and African kingdoms like the Kingdom of Aksum. Inscriptions written in the South Arabian script have been discovered on both sides of the Red Sea, and shared architectural styles and trade records link sites in Yemen with Aksumite centers in present-day Ethiopia and Eritrea. These ties were so strong that, at one point, Aksum even ruled parts of southern Arabia, leading to centuries of population mixing and cultural influence. So, with all of these deep African connections clearly established across history, archaeology, and tradition, an important question remains. How did we move from a time when many Arabs openly took pride in darker skin to a world where the idea of a black Arab seems shocking to some people? How the image of Arabs changed. The answer lies in a series of changes that happened slowly over many centuries. As populations moved across Arabia, new tribes entered the peninsula from the north and the west. Some of these groups had lighter complexions, and over time they became part of the growing Arab identity. Later, as the Islamic world expanded far beyond Arabia itself, Arab rulers formed families with women from many different regions, such as Persia, Turkey, the Caucasus, and parts of Europe. Across generations, especially among political and urban elites, these family connections gradually changed how many Arab communities looked. Little by little, the image of the typical Arab in popular imagination moved toward a lighter complexion, even though many of the older, darker-rooted Arab communities continued to exist across the peninsula and the wider Arab world. The cruel irony is that even as lighter outsiders rose in status, many native black Arabs were pushed downward in society. Over time, enslaved Africans were brought into Arab lands in large numbers, and dark skin gradually became unfairly associated with slavery. For example, a nobleman's son by a black concubine might be quietly looked down on, even if he was fully recognized as Arab. In this way, some of the original Arabs, those with the deepest roots in the peninsula, were pushed to the margins of their own history. Colonial-era racial theories later added another layer to this erasure. European writers began classifying Arabs as Semites, placing them inside the category they called the Caucasian race. In doing so, they often portrayed the ideal Arab as light-skinned or olive-skinned. Orientalist paintings and early Hollywood films repeated this image, and they rarely showed Arab leaders as dark-skinned figures. During the 20th century, some forms of Arab nationalism also adopted this lighter Mediterranean identity. Over time, the public image of the Arab became increasingly separated from its African connections, and black Arabs were further written out of the story. Inside the Arab world itself, these ideas about race began to take hold. Lighter skin became associated with status and beauty, while darker Arabs were often stigmatized. In Yemen, for example, a community of dark-skinned citizens known as the Akdam were treated as social outsiders for generations. Still, this truth has not disappeared. It remains visible in the history, in the traditions, and in the faces of people across the Arab world, waiting to be recognized again. The original Arabs were black. It is a well-supported historical conclusion that corrects stereotypes and brings attention back to the full range of Arab identity and to the people who helped shape it from the beginning. After all, Arab civilization, like all humanity, began in Africa, and from that shared beginning came cultures, languages, trade networks, poetry, and faith traditions that spread across continents. Thank you for watching. Once again, if you want deeper breakdowns, real conversations, and discussions that go beyond what platforms usually allow, join our WhatsApp group through the pinned comment and be part of a community that continues exploring these topics together. See you there.